Hello, Jess Curtis. Pleased to have this interview with you. You have had a long and varied career. So can you tell me a little bit or who you are, what you've done, and where are you today?
Sure. Hi, Susanna. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I began my career as a dancer and performer and was based in San Francisco and have then let's see, what else did I do? Began making my own work back in the late 80s, early 90s as well. I moved to Europe in the late 90s and began working with a circus in France called Cahin Kaha, Cirque Batard. The early years here in San Francisco, I worked with director Sarah Shelton Mann, who is a director and a really brilliant person that I learned a lot from, and the company Contraband. And in recent years, since moving to Europe, I began my own company called Gravity, and I then what else have I done since then? I've made a bunch of different pieces. And after working in France in the circus, I moved to Berlin, and basically since about 2002, I've been living and working in Berlin, but still bouncing back and forth between Berlin and San Francisco, and make most of my work kind of in international co-productions. Back in the early aughts, I began working with I met and through some chance circumstances, met a number of disabled artists with disabilities, professional artists with disabilities. Chief among them, maybe Claire Cunningham, but I also worked a bit with David Toole and Kaz Langley, and made a number of pieces collaborating with some disabled artists because I found them to be really compelling performers, and that kind of has, I don't know, I think over the years I've made friends with a variety of folks that have physical disabilities, and that sort of shaped my work in some ways. And then continue to make work both in Berlin and in San Francisco. And in the last couple of years, we partly from working with Claire and having done a bunch of research around making work accessible to people with diverse sensory modalities, I saw that no one was really doing much access for blind and low vision people in Berlin or San Francisco, and we started offering the service of audio description, making work accessible to blind and low vision people, both in San Francisco and in Berlin, and now throughout Germany. My company Gravity, we're offering stuff around.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to come to all of these points, particularly because this interview is going to take part in a section about body in general and body in contemporary dance. So we'll come to all those points during the interview. But to go to the very base of that, I've seen some of your works and I've followed what you've been doing, and I think that the human body is at the core of all your work. Of course, that seems obvious for choreographers who are working with movement and working with the human body, but perhaps you could describe from your point of view why that's important, or where you take this motivation from.
Sure. I think there's something around, like, I grew up very sort of sporty, and I could say, or very, was very much in my body, and the experience of my body was very central to how I chose to spend my time, and whether that was, wrestling in junior high or skiing or rock climbing, and then when I got to university and started dancing, I found the physicality of dancing to be what I loved about it. and so was really rooted in my body in that way. And it's always seemed to me that that's kind of what's important about dance, or what's unique about dance and body-based performance in general, that it should really, what I'm interested in watching, and the artists that I'm interested in watching, I think have always had really central questions about what a body is and how a body works and what a body does. And that's different than what a film can do, or different than what a poem can do, or different from what a song might be. And so that's always seemed very central in my work, and important, that there should be, and I would credit my mentor and director, Sarah Shelton Mann, really had those kind of questions at the heart of that the physical experience of the movement was what made it compelling as we were working. And that we might also be singing songs, and then we were thinking, how does this sound? Or we might be playing instruments, or we might be constructing objects in space for the scenic design, but really going to the point of, what does a body do, and how do we create from that place? So that's kind of translated to me as I continue to make work, and I'm really interested in. And then I also at one point did several years ago did a PhD, and kind of in the phenomenologies of perception, I would say, was one of my main focuses of just really thinking about what do bodies do in performance, and how do we experience performance, and how does the physicality of what we as performers are doing, how does that transmit to an audience? How does it affect their bodies? And the idea that actually going to a theater is also a physical experience, and how you're sitting in your chair or not, or what you've eaten for dinner perhaps, or who you're sitting next to, all of those things fold into the overall experience. So that's always felt to me quite central, those questions. I tend to break things down in that way. My father was a scientist, a physiologist, and so I tend to kind of try to always, that's just the way I think. I'm like, okay, what's really going on underneath all of this, and how do I learn and use that in my work?
Funny enough, because my father was a cell biologist, so maybe that comes out. The dancing comes from the science. And I know what you mean about, I love to watch the audience moving with me when I'm bending to one side, that they start bending to the side too. I find that fascinating, these mirror neurons that are working. So now you are an older dancer, and I'm interested in finding out what interests you as an older performer, using, as a body that has more experience, or how is that for you, or when you're working maybe with or watching other older dancers, what does that give to the work?
I feel like I've been being an older dancer for a while now. I made a piece with or was directed in a piece by Zilka Zed, who's got her company Resistance in Cologne, and was a duet with Angus Balbirnie. I don't know if you know Angus is a British dancer, or really Scottish. I think. Yeah. So he might not appreciate being called British. And that was, what is it like to be dancers in our 50s? And I just turned 60, so I'm no longer, I'm like, couldn't really perform that piece anymore, I guess. But it's constantly changing. And I feel like I've always, like, throughout my life and throughout my career, like when I was 21, I had a fairly serious knee injury while skiing. And so from the get-go of my professional dancing career, I had to assess sort of like, what can I do on the right side, because that knee doesn't bend like the other one does. And I feel like that process just continues, like through injuries at different moments, going like, the choreography is to do this lift, but I threw my back out yesterday, so what are we going to do today instead of that lift? And when can I get back to doing that lift? And so I think that assessment of what's possible today is kind of has always been fluid. And I think understanding that that's always fluid, of what's possible for me in general, what's possible for me today, which of the things that that are not possible for me today might be possible for me 6 months from now if I train a lot. Or, which things I do recall feeling some grief at a moment, because throughout my career, I was working in various sort of acrobatic forms and contact improv, then also literally at the circus, and learning to do some, working on my handstand. And I had a goal at one point of like, I'm going to have a great handstand at some point. I'm going to work on my handstand every day. And just to want to have a handstand that I can just go boom and stay there. And I never quite got there. And then I injured my wrist at a certain point and realized, oh, I'm never going to have like a solid handstand is not a thing I'm going to do in this life. So I feel like as an aging dancer, it's like, then there are other things I bring. I think my experience of knowing how to work around things, or bringing other experience to movement, and bringing an attention to detail. And I would say there's something about the skill of attention that I think comes with age, of like learning how to attend to the details of your physical experience is, I think, a thing that I get better at, that I've gotten better at over the years, and learning, getting more and more articulate about my experience, I think, is a thing that aging brings.
In general, maybe this is not just something I've been thinking about with this thing of body mechanics, and have we reached the final point in finding out what can the body do? I mean, I'm talking about not just the older body, but the body in general, or is there still somewhere to go? And then I began thinking about sort of, augmented reality, robotics. Is that the way things are going? Because it's going to discover more possibilities for movement, not human movement, but maybe it's related to human movement. How do you see that that development in dance?
I mean, I think we're still learning so much about what bodies do and how they do it, and I think we're probably still scratching the surface, just in terms of even understanding. Like, I feel like in the last years, maybe it's gotten a bit more hype than it deserves, but a whole opening of the idea of fascia, and in the last 25 years, people discovering and understanding, that the fascia are a very active system, and not just this slimy coating on your muscles, but that they're actually the fascia is doing stuff all the time, and people learning to work, like, what is it to attend to your fascia? Are there sensations that can be found there, or is even just the image of understanding that the fascia exists, how does that change movement possibilities? I think there's limitless information to continue to explore, and I'm sure we'll be discovering things. I think you mentioned earlier, like mirror neurons, and in writing my PhD about dance reception, mirror neurons were had been named and postulated a few years before that. And even as I was writing my dissertation, people were starting to question how useful that name was, and now people are much more inclined to use something like action reception networks as a terminology. That mirror neuron kind of implies this, like, you see something and then you do exactly the same thing. And I think that the subtlety of that, and understanding how are we perceiving the world, and how does it affect me, and how does it affect us in different ways? If I have a different experience than you have, does my doing something, maybe you can also misperceive based on your experience. So I think all of that is super interesting. I think in terms of prosthetics and AI on the one hand, and prosthetics in the other direction. Like, I have an artificial hip, and I was in a had an accident this last spring, and I also now have a titanium rod in my other leg. So I'm growing, I'm able to do a bunch of things based on prosthetics that if I was living 50 years ago, I would just be using a cane to walk around at this point. And so it's definitely extended my dance life, the technology of titanium and plastic in my body that I live with every day now, that is really a part of me. And I think, I don't know, I think it's a rich space. I'm a little bit, on one level, a little bit skeptical about technology and as a savior. Like, it's still just tools, like, and reading, sort of being in the sort of post-human era of critical theory, like, we're all in our relations to our phones. It's like I don't remember anyone's telephone number anymore. I used, growing up, I had 50 phone numbers memorized in my head, and now I have one. My girlfriend's telephone number is the only one that I actually remember. So the ways that we are sort of oozing out into the objects around us, and we're taking those objects in, I think is interesting and shaping how we work. We did audio description for a virtual reality piece at How Dry in Berlin earlier this year. And it was really interesting to me. I'd had a couple of experiences with AI that are with VR, I guess VR, with virtual reality, and found them to be really boring and kind of like uber simplistic. And and this piece, though, really was amazing. Like, you sitting with VR goggles in the audience, and then a person came running in the virtual space at me, and I felt myself like ducking to get out of the way, like how the virtual reality was affecting my body's reflexes and interacting with my body's reflexes was really, was really interesting. And then beyond interesting, like, felt like the content of that piece took a new step from just being kind of, I don't know, new technology to actually using the technology in a really interesting way.
In fact, as you've just mentioned, the audio description again, as a tool for helping people with a hearing impairment or with a disability, is of course, but I guess it's also like an artistic practice in a way, or is it also the way you're using audio description is changing the way we see bodies or the way we describe bodies, or so that it's also for people who don't maybe have an impediment or an impairment, that they can also use the audio description?
Sure. I mean, we're doing a lot of things. So the last two pieces that I made had audio description built into the pieces themselves, and the performers themselves describe what they do as they're doing it. And in my last piece, about a third of the piece was completely in the dark. So all you heard the dancers moving, and you heard their costumes, and you heard when they brushed up against the set in different ways. Like, the set was constructed so that it produced sound that would let you know, oh, somebody just went through that portal over there, somebody's walking on that surface over here. And and like, each of the performers had different shoes, so that you could tell who was walking based on, oh, that's Gabrielle because they're wearing flip-flops, and I learned that earlier in the piece. So I think for me, it's a very rich territory that I've been really interested in, and really, I was really brought to it a lot by my colleague Claire Cunningham, who was very interested in our piece, The Way You Look at Me Tonight. She was like, we're going to really build access into the piece as opposed to just tacking it on later. And we did quite a bit of research. We had a residency at the Place in London and brought in a number of blind actors and directors, and Mikhail Smithens and Maria Oshodi from Extant Theater, and a number of deaf and artists, and as well as interpreters and audio describers. So I think it's really rich. And I think it's always, when I teach it and teach, I've been teaching giving trainings on how to do audio description, mostly for dancers or people with physical experience. But I find it really helps me as a maker to think about, how is my audience understanding this experience, and who am I leaving out, and who am I including, and who am I prioritizing or preferencing certain kinds of skills or certain ways of being in the world. And if I'm performing in a theater that's up a flight of stairs, then a certain amount of my friends are not going to be able to come to the show. And if this meaningful moment is only being transmitted through the visual, then certain people are not going to understand it. So and I feel like it makes a richer experience for everybody in the work. So I find it really useful and very interesting. And I think there's still ample room for a whole range of people to do different amounts. Like, I think it's still useful if you made a piece and you weren't thinking all those things as you were making it, yet it's still useful to have a service come in and go, we as audio describers come and we'll go, okay, we can watch your piece once, and then we can describe what we think is necessary for a visually impaired audience member to understand what you're doing.
Yes, and you were just talking about, yes, sort of the inclusive aspect of also from the audience point of view of who's able to come and watch this piece or not. And so just wanted to ask a little bit about your inclusive work or working with people with disability. Then we see a huge variety of bodies on the stage. So how does inclusion change the way dance looks and the way we look at dance?
I mean, I think it does many things. It makes the very simple fact of a wider range of bodies and experiences part of the performance, or part of the possibility of a performance. So, and I find, it makes it much more interesting to me in many ways. It's like, I think we come, particularly in staged dancing, like one of the main traditions of performed classical dance is the ballet, and which really comes out of a certain kind of ideology of everyone being the same. If you look at the history of ballet and Louis XIV, it was really coming out of military drills, and even many ballet schools still have weight and height requirements and limitations for the young people, particularly the young women who are going to be in the corps de ballet, have to be, not shorter than 5 feet and not taller than 5'4". I have a friend in Italy who is in La Scala training, and she had a growth spurt and they kicked her out of the school because she passed at 14 years old. She passed. So I think that ideal of an ideal body was a fiction that really came out of a certain kind of monarchistic, monotheistic ideology that is just has not served us very well in the world, and has a lot of downsides. And I think a more diverse range of bodies being on stage bring a much more diverse set of experiences that I think if I think dance and performance, I still have some part of me that idealistically believes that we're actually bringing something new to the world that is making the world a better place. And that if every once in a while I can do something where an idea that we generated in the studio affects the people in my audience, and they go, oh, wow, I understood something I didn't understand about how the world works in a better way. And I feel like having more diverse experiences in the studio means we're more likely to have more interesting and more important information available for our audiences as well.
No, I've just done my first inclusive dance piece, and I realized how I'm really at the very beginning, and there's so much to learn and so much to learn from so many people who have more experience, and it's been fascinating. We're trying to set up an inclusive program in Nuremberg for the first time, because there's really very little happening, I would say, also in the south of Germany. It's not very developed, so we're hoping that that will work. Yeah. So thank you very much, Jess.
Thank you, Susanna.